Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Greetings of peace, loved ones worldwide, wherever you may be. Love and light to you and to yours. You're tuned in to Path and Present Podcast, and I'm your host, Baraka Blue. We have a wonderful podcast coming up for you with Shems Friedlander, who is someone I've known for a number of years, and his son Nuri is also a friend of mine. He is an author. Many of you might know him through his books, but he's also a painter, photographer, filmmaker, educator, multidisciplined artist, and someone who's been on the path for many, many decades and has a really wonderful journey. And he shared that journey with me, so look forward to sharing it with you. Before I do, though, I wanted to make a few announcements. The first one is that we have the second annual Drawing Near to the Beloved Poetry and Praise of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam workshop, which is through Rumi Center for Spirituality and the Arts. We did it last year as the first one, and basically it's a 30-day online Mawlid celebrating the beloved Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, coming together, sharing poetry, studying the great tradition of praise poetry, starting with the companions themselves, talking about the alchemical power of, praise, and studying the life and legacy of the beloved. And, one of the most special aspects of it is that we have a number of guest scholars and guest artists each week. So guest scholars include Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, Dr. Timothy Winter, Sheikh Abdul Hakim Rad, Idris Watts, Dr. Alu Damini. And artists include Amir Suleiman, Sakina Douglas, Brother Ali, Pearls of Islam, Ali Keeler from Firdaus Ensemble. So it's really an amazing cast of people coming together, people who are specialists in the tradition themselves, who are artists, practitioners themselves, sharing the living tradition of poetry and praise of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So if you're a writer, or even if you're not a writer, if you're just someone who is a lover of the beloved, it's a really blessed way to celebrate and to make the month of Rabiul Awwal special. So you can find more information or register on rumicenterworkshops.com. rumicenterworkshops.com. And this starts November 3rd and goes for 30 days. So come celebrate the month of Rabiul Awwal and the blessing of the beloved, peace be upon him, with us, inshallah. Other than that, let's see, this week I will be at NYU Abu Dhabi. NYU has a campus in Abu Dhabi, and I'll be there for a week-long residency, doing a series of classes. We'll be doing a film screening of The Alchemist of Happiness and discussing that film, which is about the life and legacy of Imam al-Ghazali. I'll also be giving a lecture on the poetry and philosophy of Maulana Rumi, and then I'll be teaching a poetry writing workshop. So if you're in the region, if you're in the Emirates, come on through, and you can find more information about that on my social media. We'll give you the podcast now. But before we do, last thing, I wanted to thank everyone who supports the podcast. Everyone who is a supporter through Patreon is the reason that we're able to do this and do this on a consistent basis. So we want to send special love and light to everyone who supports through Patreon. Patreon is a site that allows you to support content creators, and Path and Present has a page on Patreon where you can support monthly. $1 or $5 or $10 a month helps make this possible. So thank you for those who are supporting, and if you would like to support, please visit pathandpresent.com. Patreon.com/pathandpresent. Yep. All right, y'all. One love. Alhamdulillah. So, mashallah. Yeah, it's a blessing to sit with you. And I know I've been wanting to do this for some time, and I've been flaking, as you called it, so it's true. So happy to finally be here with you.
Alhamdulillah, everything in its right time.
So I'm curious about your journey. I know we've talked a little bit about it, and I've had the blessing of reading your memoirs, Winter Harvest, which is kind of little snapshots into moments in your life. And it's interesting because it's not even chronological. It just is kind of how the memory works, where you remember like, oh yeah, I remember when I was 15 then, and I was 33, and then I was here and there. So it kind of like traces your journey. So just by way of introduction, and you could speak about this book if you want, but you've had a very interesting journey thus far, and I'm sure it continues to get more and more interesting. But I'd love if you could just share a little bit about your origin story, so to speak.
Well, first of all, I think this question that keeps coming up when everyone is interviewed of how you became a Muslim has gotten quite banal to me. And I think it's absolutely the wrong question. And the right question should really be, why did you become a Muslim? What was in your life, and what touched you in such a way that you wanted to embrace Islam? And I embraced Islam in the West. It was more that I met somebody. You know, I had been involved in the spiritual path in the West for many, many, many years. At a certain point in the 60s, the spiritual energy from the East started moving to the West. And we started seeing gurus in New York and sheikhs in New Jersey and rabbis in Chicago, and all of these holy and spiritual and pious beings were bringing teachings that originated in the West, in the East, to the West. And we sort of were at a point, most of us, where we were not enamored by the lifestyle of our parents, and as most generations always have some problem with that. But we wanted to find a way to ourselves. Wanted to find an inner road to ourselves and reason for being. And this all occurred with the energy that these people brought with them. I mean, they brought this energy, they gave us this energy, and we gave them our attention. And that was a nice exchange. And with that, we had experiences and learned things about meditation and prayer, and not rushing through life, and making the value of life monetary instead of the interior value of what's the preciousness of our heart and why we were created. So that was sort of like the state my generation was sort of in at that time. And we were very open, you know. It was the time of flower power and San Francisco and sort of free love, and everything was... but we were really in a search. It was an inner search. And a kind of, not a full negation, but a sliding away from the mannerism of working 9 to 5 at some job one is not interested in, many times. Sort of like what Henry David Thoreau said in Civil Disobedience, when he noted that most men live lives of quiet desperation, you know, and added to that, from the cradle to the grave. And I think we didn't want that. We didn't want to live a life of quiet desperation. We wanted to have some meaning brought into our life, and we found that spirituality was one serious way to influence us toward what we would felt was a better life.
Yeah. And I mean, that's so interesting because, and I'm fascinated, but about this time period, the counterculture 60s and 70s, for a lot of reasons. And it's so transformational. And of course, in every age, in every society, there's always those kind of like seekers who start to seek for meaning and kind of reject the dominant worldly culture and, that track of, getting a job and acquiring more and. But what's interesting about that period, 60s and 70s, is it became not only like a peripheral thing, but it became like dominant culture. Like counterculture became dominant culture in a sense. And I mean, the number one singers and artists like Bob Dylan were anti-war. And the Beatles being the, biggest pop stars, they went to India to find a guru, and that was on the front page of Time and all these magazines. So I'm curious, what do you think it was about that moment that made that message of rejecting the dominant Western way of life and the forms of religion, and the militarism and all these things, rejecting so much? What do you think it was that made it not just a marginal thing, but capture a whole generation in that sense?
I think part of it was that this energy was moving, the spiritual energy was moving from the east to the west, and it was like a wind, or rain, that everyone who drinks that rain is going to have a feeling of something else, So I think that was a great part of it, and I think every generation goes through. If you look at what's happening today, we have some 16-year-old girl from Europe, Greta Thunberg, who's now the leading spokesperson in the world for climate change, and realizing it took a 16-year-old girl to wake the world up that climate change is a very serious problem, and that we're all going to suffer negatively from it unless we take it in hand and deal with it. So we had those things. Every generation has something that comes through. And I think ours was at that time just a spiritual turnover. And we were very much, at least the people I knew, were very much in the arts. And I had started years and years before that in the Gurdjieff work. Yeah. When I was 19 years old, I met a teacher of Gurdjieff who knew Gurdjieff, and his name was Willem Nyland, and he was an amazing human being. And it was like a father figure to me. I was only 19. I was a teenager, believe it, And through that, we learned about Krishnamurti, and those people were around. I sat with Krishnamurti, I sat with Willem Nyland, I sat with a lot of these people, these gurus that came. And I remember one incident, it was in a retreat in the mountains of Chamonix, and there was a Tibetan Buddhist giving a talk, and his name was Lama Chimi, I just remembered, and he gave this talk, and afterwards I walked up to him and I said, can I speak to you? And he says, oh, you were interested in my talk? And I said, well, actually, I wasn't that interested in the talk. It was interesting, but it didn't move me that much. But what I really want to know about is how you folded that piece of paper at the end of your talk. That's what I'm interested in. And he said, well, I've had students that haven't seen that come. And we went off and sat on two big rocks on the mountains in Switzerland, and he gave me a transmission. He gave me some lessons. So there's a responsibility not only in the teacher, there's a responsibility in the one who wants to learn. And that's a very important thing that we should know. It's like painting, I'm a painter, but I can put something in a painting, and you can look at that painting, and you can get something from that painting that I didn't even intend. And it doesn't make that any less valid. That's still part of the painting. So the painting is a result of the viewer and the painter. As a combination of both creates that painting. It's sort of like the taste of the apple is not in the apple, and the taste of the apple is not in the person. The taste of the apple emerges when the person and the apple gets together. There's a big message in that.
Yeah, that's powerful.
That we if we keep separation, unity is what brings out the taste and flavor of life.
Mm-hmm.
Community, unity, togetherness. We need other people to live. Yes, some people can live alone and even live in a cave and whatever, but that's not the purpose that Allah has put us here for. You know, He put us here really to be together, and in that togetherness to understand why we're here, which is to know Him.
Yeah, so the Gurdjieff work or movement, I'm curious about that, and I've read a little bit about it in your book and in a few other places. But at that time, was it, widespread? And for those that aren't familiar with it, can you explain a little bit, just an introduction to that kind of worldview and the teachings?
Well, Gurdjieff was a Greek Caucasian who came to the West. He had been in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and people like P.D. Uspensky, who was a great mathematician and thinker of the time, met him, and a number of other people in Britain that were known as sort of spiritual seekers met him, and slowly he started to make an inroad with these people. And it was a work that he gathered together, or was put together by Gurdjieff from his travels. He traveled to Cairo, he traveled to Asia, throughout Asia, to Afghanistan, to all these, secret and sacred places, and brought back a teaching. And that teaching was about remembering yourself, knowing who you are, why you're here. And he wrote this incredible book, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, called All and Everything, right? Which is some 800 or 900 page book. And it's a kind of an amazing story. Within that story is the hidden teaching of what he was talking about. And he uses a lot of Islamic terms. He did a couple of characters, Hussein and Hassan, with two brothers in it. And you have to read deeper. Most of these books that were written at that time by masters emulated, in a sense, without even knowing it, the structure of like sacred texts like the Quran. Because in the Quran you can read it on one level and you get something, but there are 7 deeper levels. And there are very, very few people who can go past the 3rd or 4th level and really understand the essence of what is said. After all, when we read the Quran, we should shiver, I think, and tremble. If we understand what it really is, these we are reading, at the same time reading and listening to the words of Allah. This is a revealed book. It's a revelation. It's not a book. And within that revelation are many different layers. That's why we need sheikhs and teachers and masters and people who spent their lives understanding that, to touch those spots in ourselves that can relate to that. So Gurdjieff, I don't think it was what we would call a huge teaching. There were a lot of people involved in different countries, but it was always kept sort of secret in a way. They didn't go out and announce that they were Gurdjieffians, but like anything else, it began to dissipate, and there were problems, and some teachers felt they understood it one way, and others felt they understood it another way, and there were splits, and these splits involved them in other kind of things, and then it got to another generation with people who never met Gurdjieff, and but it has its validity within a certain area. Like many of these teachings, they're like Gurdjieff used to say, we take a few crumbs off the idea table and we make that a teaching. So many people have taken a few crumbs from Islam and a few crumbs from Sufism, a few crumbs from Hinduism, and a few crumbs from this and that, and they make that the teaching, and soon you're drifting off in another direction, and not seeing the essence of what Because real teaching is a lifestyle. A real teaching takes a life to do. And we're given this life. Really, when you think about why you're here, there's a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that says, "I was a hidden treasure and wished to be known, so I created man in order to be known." Now, this really is the answer to life. People walk around troubled in their minds and their souls and their bodies, thinking, "Why am I here? What am I supposed to do?" And the essence is right there. That Allah says He created us because He wished to be known, which means that He created a being that has the ability to know Him. Okay, we've been given the ability to know Him, and we know Him because He says, "I'm secret." Allah is secretly hidden within His names. So through the Tawheed, through the repetition of the name of Allah, we can get to know Allah. We can get to know. We perhaps can see in some way that which is unseen. Because to see the unseen is impossible. And the only way you can see the unseen is through something that's seen. So we're stuck in that place, But there is a methodology. Islam is a lifestyle. And it's a lifestyle really that's very much misinterpreted today and misunderstood today, even by people that call themselves Muslims. There's no wholesale killing in Islam. There's no wholesale harming anyone else in Islam. It's just not allowed. If someone attacks you, you're allowed to defend yourself, but it's never that you should attack someone else. And it's very important to understand. We know before we eat we should say Bismillah. In the name of Allah. It's a simple phrase, right? But what it does is it connects us and the food and the nourishment and the strength that comes from it to Allah. How many people remember that? And if you do you remember at the end to say, Alhamdulillah, all praises to Allah, He has given this food. We think the food comes from the supermarket and so I think there's a necessity to bring it closer to one's heart, bring that teaching closer to one's heart. And I have found that, for me, Sufism is the path, and there is no, I'll emphatically state this, there is no Sufism without Islam. You cannot be a Sufi unless you're a Muslim. You can be a Muslim and not have to be a Sufi, but you cannot be a Sufi because Sufism is based on La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Right? There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is His prophet. Right? So the messenger of Allah is part of the teaching. And you can't separate that.
Yeah. And He's the master of all the masters. He's the spiritual teacher of all the spiritual teachers. He's the source of all the Sufi orders, for sure. I love this, and it's so true that there are layers, and the outward acts of worship, they have their, like a lot of people, when they say inshallah, it means like, no, I'm not going to do it, right? But when the saints say inshallah, they're actually experiencing that, like, I don't have any power to even take my next breath unless it's from Allah.
In the Quran, it says, never do anything, never say anything without prefacing it with inshallah, if it is the will of Allah, because we then understand that this is not our will. That there is a guide, there's something behind us. We think when you move to Cairo, you think, when I moved to Cairo, maybe I thought, oh, I'm moving to Cairo. I made that decision. I'm going to get a job in Cairo. I'm going to work at the university, and I'll, but this is all within the scope of the will of Allah.
And and like in the first discourse in the Masnavi, Rumi says, when he's talking about the doctors that say they're going to heal this sick girl, they say that, they're all the best doctors, say, we'll heal her. But then he says, but they didn't say inshallah. And so they had no power. And then he says something interesting. He said, and I don't just mean that they didn't say inshallah, because some people, they don't actually say it on their lips, but in their being, in their heart, they're experiencing inshallah. it's supposed to transform you until you actually experience that like, complete reliance, complete need that everything is within that unfolding of Allah, and that we are nothing. We're pure need. We're the fuqara.
Well, we are something. We're the creation of Allah, and within that creation, we're allowed certain things. Like I had a student in when I was teaching in Cairo, who used to come to my office, and I had all these Sufi books and books on Islam and books, all around on different spiritual paths. And he kept coming back, and he was sort of taken by the ambience of the place. I had an office, I burned incense, and it was like a very nice feeling in that space. And one day he says, "Oh, like Dr. Shems, you're my sheikh." I said, No, I'm not your sheikh. And he says, No, I feel that you're my sheikh. I said, No, I'm not your sheikh. And again he said it, and again I said, No, I'm not. And when he said it the next time, I said, Look, let's assume that I'm your sheikh. Your sheikh is saying to you, he's not your sheikh. I said, but I understand what you're interested in something. You feel something, you want something to open in you, and I understand that, and you're correct as far as that's concerned. I said, but I can tell you everything I know in 10 minutes. I said, and then you don't even have to walk up the 5 flights of stairs to get to my office, And I said, what I know for sure, without any doubt in my mind, my heart, every fiber of my being, I know La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. I know that. I said, I know a few other things. And I know about a lot of things. But really knowing something is different than knowing about something. And I said, I know when I get up in the morning, I put my shirt on. Every time I button my shirt, every button, I say the name of Allah. And at night when I take that shirt off, every unbutton of every button, I say the name of Allah. When I walk down the stairs from my office to the street to go teach a class in the university, every time my foot hits the stair, I remember Allah. I said, these are the things I know. Right? And I know that when if you want to do what the cook of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi did, who was also his Khalifa, Atesh Bas Veli, when he made a big pot of bulgur or cooked meat or fish, whatever he cooked, grains, rice, salad, anything he made, anything he cooked, he took a wooden spatula, and with the wooden flat end of the wood, he wrote the name of Allah into the food. Whether it was soup, rice, it didn't matter. And by writing that into the food, he introduced a certain energy, not only to himself, he gained from it, but to everyone that ate that food. They were nourished by something that had the name of Allah written on it. Now that's something everybody can do. Everybody can do that. The point is, do we do it? We know to do something like that, but do we do it? Or has the magnetism of this world completely drained us of all possibilities? I think not. But we have to slow down, stop. There's a hadith that says that haste is from the shaitan and slowness is from Allah. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do anything, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't earn a living and you shouldn't work. No, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that we have to take time in our day to sit quietly and breathe in and breathe out and remember Allah. And if we do this and we open ourselves in that way, we'll see that life can change, and all of the loneliness and depression that a lot of these young people are feeling, in my opinion, is because we've created a huge gap between ourselves and Allah. And that gap is filled with loneliness and depression and being upset and anxieties. You know, Mark Twain, who was a great, as you know, Samuel Clemens, he was a great satirist, right? American satirist. He once wrote, "Most of my problems I've never encountered." They're in your mind. They're in our mind. Most of them don't actually appear, but we feed them with our attention. Anything you feed grows. If you put water on a plant, if you feed an animal, you feed yourself, you grow. Everything grows, right? If you feed your loneliness, that loneliness will grow. So I think it's important that we have to back up a little bit, you know. And unfortunately, we've been taken by the magnetism of the cell phones. I mean, they're excellent for what they can do. They can do a lot of things. But, you know, there's a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that says, anxiety is half of aging. Anxiety is half of aging. Wow. You know. And that little phone that you hold in your pocket and in your hand and take everywhere from the bedroom to the bathroom to wherever you go is filled with anxiety. And it's filled with the recipe to your loneliness, the recipe to being unhappy, because everything is based on what someone else thinks. And they don't really think that. They don't care. You know, it's a momentary reaction to something that's minute, and people just sit there fiddling with their phones for half the day. This time will never come back. You know, people have stopped reading books. You know, when they want to read a book, they'll read something on the phone. You know, it's to me, it's a sadness that's occurred. You know, like
yeah, I don't know if you saw, there was this like photo journalism like project or article that I read, that it was just photographs of people across America, but they had like airbrushed the phones out of the pictures. So it showed like a couple at a dinner table just staring at their hands and how insane it looked. Like they're both not looking at each other, they're just looking at their hand. Or, you know, a mother sitting next to her children, but she's not interacting with the children. She's looking at the phone and the child's looking at this big screen, but the screen's gone. So it's just, they're just looking into midair. But it showed like, it was a powerful visual.
Children imitate their parents. I mean, it's a normal, natural thing. Little babies, they just do whatever their parents do. They imitate their emotions. When they can speak, they imitate their speech, whatever they're. So if you're holding your phone all the time, and your child see that, your 1 or 2 year old child is just going to do the same thing. Want the phone and hold the phone and play with it and move it and all kinds of things. If you're reading a book, they're going to want to read a book. So I'm not saying throw away your phone, but I'm saying be more understanding of the influence. It's like secondhand smoke. You know, if you really care, if you care about your children, you don't smoke in the house, because secondhand smoke can really kill them. It can influence them, make them sick.
So, to like tie it in with the trajectory, so that 60s and 70s, and I know you mentioned to me that I think you first came to Konya, was it 1971? Is that what you told me? Something like that?
Yeah, 70.
So how does this happen? So, and this is really interesting because, as you mentioned, counterculture 60s, all this Eastern spirituality is coming in. You know, you have gurus coming, you have lamas and Zen Buddhist teachers, and, you know, and you have people going to India. You have all this back and forth, this opening. You have books being published and books being translated, right? Be Here Now, an autobiography of a yogi, and all these things, right? And everyone's reading it, and it's like people experimenting with psychedelics and the art and the, you know. But there's an interesting, like, segment. Of course, it's more popular. People say, oh, people found a guru or they found a Buddhist teacher. But there's a number of people who went to the Near East, right, and found Islam, usually through the door of Sufism. So how was those streams, how did those streams kind of come across your radar, and how did you find yourself going to these?
Well, I was, as I said before, very much part of that spiritual movement in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, I knew Ram Dass very well, and Pir Vilayat Khan and all those people that kind of went from here to there and came back. And I remember Ram Dass had an enormous influence in the young people of that generation. He found Neem Karoli Baba. I mean, if you read Be Here Now, you know the whole story. I won't repeat his story, but he found a guru, you know, and at the end of many amazing experiences that he had with him in India, he came back and shared that with the young people in New York and California and then the rest of the country. And part of it was, I mean, for example, Neem Karoli Baba gave him his blanket that he meditated on. Now that's a very sacred piece of clothing. It's like the sheikh that gives a hurka, you know. In Sufism, the sheikh will give a hurka. The hurka doesn't necessarily have to be a cloak, which is what the word means, but it could be any item of clothing. It could be a hat, it could be shoes, it could be a cloak, it could be a shirt, it could be any item of clothing. And it also can be a form of knowledge. The hurka can also be a form of knowledge that the sheikh gives to the murid. So Ram Dass came back with this sacred cloth, let's say, that Neem Karoli Baba meditated on. We all know that if you sit in meditation, as the same thing occurs when you're in Zikr Allah, in a Devran, or in a Qiyam, when you're making Zikr Allah, or even sitting alone in your room. What you sit on and what you wear, if it's natural fiber, cotton, wool, small particles of energy leave your body as your state rises. And this energy penetrates into natural fiber and into wood. That's why you can enter a room sometimes and feel, oh, this is a very special place. You don't know why, but maybe people have meditated there or prayed there for a long time, you know, and that energy remains in that room and you walk into it. And the same thing, like certain dervish orders, you wear a particular kind of vest. You wear that vest all the time, you know. And when you put that vest on, you almost feel like you're into that energy, just permeates you of that. So with that, knowing all of that, Ram Dass came back with this blanket, right, which was a sacred blanket that Neem Karoli Baba sat and meditated on for many, many years. And instead of wrapping around himself and keeping it, he started to unstrand the pieces of wool that were woven to make the carpet. And he got hundreds and hundreds of little pieces of wool and cut them up in little 2-inch pieces and gave them out to everybody that came around. Right? So it was like that sharing also, you know, of the hurka, of the knowledge, right? That you come back, and yes, he gave lots of talks, and he gave, but he also gave this little, anyone came there, he gave them this little pieces. Like sometimes Tibetan masters will give you a red string and you can tie it around your neck, and you're not supposed to take it off. You just wear it, wash with it, shower with it, everything, and finally, eventually it will disintegrate of its own lifespan, let's say, right? So there's that kind of exchange that happens between, like Mevlana says, the thirsty man is searching for water, but water is also searching for the thirsty man. So we're looking for a sheikh, but that sheikh is also looking for somebody. Like Shamsi Tabriz was looking for somebody, right? He finally, when he swooned in front of the street in Konya, when they met, you know, it wasn't because he was so shocked that Mevlana knew the answer to his question. No, what it was that he finally found the one he was looking for. So this is how and when you look back, it's interesting to see even the people that stayed within various paths that occurred,
Yeah.
and the people who had another gender, their own children, and what happened to those? Some of those children followed in the paths of their parents. Mm-hmm. Some of them went and became stock market brokers or people in, in the tech industry or whatever, which fine, but it didn't mean that they followed necessarily. But there's also some, I believe there's some seed or some thing that comes off of you that enters your children, sure. And whether they use it or even know about it or not, it's there. So there's a great responsibility in who you are and what you do in your life,
sure.
Not only to yourself but to your own children that you.
So I know you're living in Turkey now, but Turkey's been a big part of your journey, and the Jarahi order and Mevlana Rumi. So how did that come to be that you first came to Turkey and first came to be involved with the Sufi masters here?
In, 1972, I think, the Mevlevi were on a world tour, and they came to the Brooklyn Academy of Music for, I think, a week or 10 nights, something like that. And I went, naturally. And at the end of their evening, I went back behind the stage and introduced myself and quickly made friends with a couple of people there. One musician in particular, Nezi Uzel, who, Rahmatullah, is not alive at the moment, but he opened a lot of doors for me into Turkish Sufism, and we became close friends during that 10-day period. And I invited them. They were staying in some hotel near Columbus Circle. And I had a coach house in New York that I used as a studio and a place to live. It was a building that was behind a building. You couldn't see it. And I invited them all, musicians, the semazens, the musicians, everyone. I said, after the sema, you come back to my house. We'll have tea, we'll have coffee, we'll play music, we'll have something to eat, and just make sohbet, just talk to each other. And they all did, like all of them. So my house was crowded every night after their performance. Maybe 25 people would come storming in. And we got very close then. We made zikrs, and we'd send out for pizza, and we'd eat something and drink a lot of tea and have sohbet and talk. And it was very relaxed and very nice. And it was good for them because they're living in hotels all the time, and they're going from here to here, and they don't have any human connection in a certain way, So they came, and then when they left, the Sheikh, Selman Tuzan was his name at that time, and he said, when you come to Turkey, please come to Konya and visit us, and come to Shebi Arus, which is the time that's celebrated for the passing of Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi. It's sort of called Shebi Arus, the wedding night, right? Which means the time when he became in union with his beloved, with Allah. Somehow I did, and that was in like October, or the end of October, beginning of November. I can't remember the exact, And then in December came very quickly. I decided, okay, I'm gonna go, and a friend of mine went with me. We went together, and came to Istanbul, and then we went to Konya, and it's sort of, I've described it as going from the city of 100,000 traffic lights to the city of one traffic light, because that's what Konya was like at that time. It was really like a town. It's not the city it is today. There's skyscrapers and lots of big apartment buildings. And it was very different in those days. And I had gone to Istanbul, met Nezi, and then Nezi was going to Konya because he was one of the musicians playing at the Sema. And so I was quickly brought into the midst of the people there and quite welcomed, because they were saying, well, we will travel all over the world and you're the only one that took us into their house. We're like this. This is how we are. So we felt very good, being able to be welcomed into your house and to be given tea and coffee and food, and, we were comfortable. And so they made me very comfortable there, and everybody sort of seemed to know me. And that was the beginning. And that few nights later was the beginning of the Shebe Arus, just before it. And we were in the lobby of the Hotel Shaheen. I don't even know if it's still there, but it's on the main street, Mevlana Chadesa, and all the dervishes were staying there. We were staying there also. And this burly gentleman walks in with his overcoat and a white hat on, and three guys next to him, surrounding him, like also with little white hats on. And everybody started running over to kiss his hand. I thought to myself, oh, he must be somebody, he must be some, Well, it turned out that was Sheikh Muzaffar. And so I went over and greeted him, he greeted me, and that seemed to be it for the moment. And that night there was going to be a zikr that he would lead at someone's apartment in Konya. And people were chosen who could come because it was a very small space. I was asked to go, and I went. And it was, although December, the apartment, because there were so many people crowded in, there may have been 75 or 80 people in this tiny apartment, was very hot, And I was sort of pasted against one of the oven walls, and the several dervishes that came with Muzaffar Effendi, and he sat in a circle, and some Mevlevis joined the circle, and there were other Mevlevis standing around them with instruments to play. It was going to be, and everybody else was sort of wherever they could be to witness this, right? And I thought, I can't just stay against this wall in the heat. I can't breathe. And I don't know what led me to do it, something. And I just went between Muzaffar Effendi and his Khalifa, and I sort of nudged them aside and planted myself between them. Muzaffar Effendi just looked at me and he didn't say anything. Okay, if Allah sent you there, you're here, And a zikr started, and I very quickly fell into the rhythm of the zikr, and it felt like a very normal thing for me to do. I felt really at home. And it went on for a few hours, and afterwards Muzaffar Effendi turned to me and he said, you make zikr like us, and he kissed my eyes, and he said, I want you to come visit me in Istanbul. I said, Inshallah, I'm be in Istanbul in a week. And he meticulously wrote down exactly where I was to go and where to find him and like this. And then I went, of course, and that was sort of the beginning. And I kept going to his bookshop every day, and there was sohbets in the afternoon. And the first time I saw him pray, I said, I want to do that. It was an amazing experience. I felt he wasn't praying for himself; he was praying for everybody. It just came. It was just in this tiny bookshop. There was only room for one person to pray, and he'd pray, and we all sat around and went. And that was sort of the introduction to sort of Turkish Sufism, which I kept going back there every year, actually, all the time. But the next time I went was the next December, and so I had met Muzaffar Effendi in December, and Tosun Baba met him in the June preceding that particular December, and I got a call one day in New York. This is Tosun Barak, and Muzaffar Effendi called me, and he said, "You're coming to Istanbul to see him. I said, yes. He said, well, he needs some medicine, and I've gotten the medicine, and he asked if you would please bring it for him. I said, of course I will. And so Tosin came to my house in New York, and that's how we met. And we became very close friends over 50 years before he passed away just a year and a half ago. So I became very close in the inner circle somehow. I was quickly invited into the inner circle and remained there. And Sefer Effendi was made my teacher by Muzaffer Effendi, and whenever I was there, I would sit with him, go to his house, and we'd sit together, and it was that kind of. So that was how I sort of got involved in the Jarrahis. And
so for those that don't know, the Jarrahi order, or about Muzaffer Effendi, maybe you could just share a little bit about the Jarrahi order, and just what it was like to be with Muzaffer Effendi, because I've heard so many amazing stories and read books about him, and he's really a larger-than-life individual.
He was larger than life. There's no question about it. He was that expression. I mean, when he entered a room, it's like if a movie star entered the room. Everybody would turn, and there was an energy that was created, maybe more from the people than from the person himself. But with him, he entered a room, and he brought that energy, and there was no way you could deny there was somebody of a rare quality that had just stepped into that room. I mean, I've been with him on Hajj and Umrah, and even when he just walks into the mosque, the Prophet's mosque, people just looking like, oh, it must be a great sheikh, or somebody, even though they had no idea who he was. He just had that presence about him, when that sort of very high Islamic confidence, and being a Sufi master, he just embodied a teaching within him. And with every step he took, that teaching just flowed, so he was like that, and of course, when you're with him, like when you're with anyone, like if you don't know them, there's an illusion of them. If you sort of know them, and like we go for coffee every night with him and Bayezid and sit around all night long having coffee, and they would all smoke cigarettes, and was very make sohbet like this, and it was just part of an element, and because if you come from the outside and don't know what's going on or don't know what's happened, then you create a sort of, there's an expression that says the sheikh can't fly, but the murids give him wings, that kind of an attitude. But Muzaffer Effendi was, without doubt, a very, very special human being, and he was a great sheikh, and I learned more from him than any other human being in my life. And the sadness for me when he passed was, for me, that stopped in a certain way. He was always making soft. Whatever he talked about, there was a lesson. Whatever, even if he walked, there was a lesson in that. If he, so he was the embodiment of a Sufi master, and he was walking around us, and yet he had enormous compassion. He just was a very loving, very powerful, but a very loving being.
And he was like trained in, he was a scholar of the outward sciences, and that, wasn't he like the imam of a mosque for a time?
Well, he was an orphan. His father died when he was within 6 weeks or 6 months of his life. He was orphaned at a young age, and as he grew up, he was taken over by certain sheikhs, Sami Effendi, Ismail Haqi Effendi. These were people that took him, and they were like a father image as well as a sheikh to him, you know. And he was a hafiz of the Quran. He was taught Quran. He was taught. He went and studied. He studied the music, the Allahis, the sacred Allahis, and he studied fiqh, and he studied hadith, and he was very knowledgeable about all of this, you know. And he was, I mean, you could see as you look back at his life that he was obviously someone who was chosen to become what he was going to become, that he already was that, but he had to take all the steps, let's say, to get to that point, which he was guided into. So at first he was a imam of a small mosque, and then that mosque collapsed or was burned or something, and he grew up very poor, actually. Don't forget, it was the First World War. You know, he was born in the middle of the First World War, so there was great poverty, and you know, there was trauma. There was
great transition, right? Because the Ottoman Empire just falling. And,
that's right.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just a war. It was like an empire had fallen, and the structure of everything was collapsing, and monetarily people were struggling, and economically people were struggling, and nobody knew the direction things were going to go in. I mean, he was born in the end of 1916, which was basically the middle of the war, you know. So he struggled a lot in his youth and did not have an easy upbringing, you know. His mother at one time wanted to send him to military school because she felt that he could at least be taken care of. He would be given clothes. He would be given food. You know, he would learn a trade. He would have some way of making a living. And she had a dream. And then the dream, this sheikh, she never named him, but this sheikh came to her and said, do not send him to military school. Send him to become a hafiz. And so he studied to become a hafiz. He became a hafiz. Then, as I say, he had that small mosque that collapsed. And then he, for some time, was the imam. He was the imam of that mosque. For some time, he became the imam during Ramadan of the mosque at Suleimania, the great Suleimania mosque, Imam Sinan's mosque. And then he became a bookseller, and he learned about bookselling, and he had a shop in the Sahaf al-Chadesi, which is the booksellers area in the covered bazaar. And he started to get more wealthy because he had a knowledge of antiquated books, of old books and the value when people didn't know. Don't forget, they went through a period that was just about to be, you know, that began, and for 25 years, from the time of the collapse of the beginning of the Republic, let's say, till the early 50s, when he was a bookseller, there were no books allowed. Nothing was allowed to be written in Arabic. You know, in one night, all of the calligraphers were out of work. They couldn't write. Hamid Aytaç was a great Turkish calligrapher. And in one night, he went from writing Quranic phrases and ayats of the Quran and hadith to writing book jacket covers and advertising, because nobody was allowed to write in Arabic those. So there was a dearth of you know, it became like a desert of that, and he became very knowledgeable about those old books. So when in the 50s they were allowed to be sold in bookstores and things changed a little bit, you know, he was an expert at that. So he knew their value when others didn't know their value, you know, and he became sort of relatively well off, you know, as a result of that. And then he was made the imam of a very small mosque in the bazaar, which was so tiny. We used to go there on Friday, and you could only pray by touching the back of the person in front of you, because it was just so crowded. People were shoulder to shoulder, and you know, like in a sardine can. And then he was this very well-known bookseller, and then he became a very well-known sheikh, and you know, like.
Yeah. So Would you like tie this in with the Jarahi order? And I know, like, I've heard from you and a few others, like the unique history of the Jarahis tying in with this period, because the Sufi orders are obviously like incredibly influential and powerful in the Ottoman period, and then overnight, just, you know, it wasn't just you can't write in Arabic, but all of these are closed down. It's illegal to be a Sufi. It's illegal to be a Dede or a Sheikh or and so that happens, but the Jarahi order somehow has like an adaptation that allows it to preserve the tradition in a way that other orders weren't necessarily.
Well, Faridin Effendi, who was the sheikh at the time of his father was a sheikh before him. He knew nothing. He didn't have any trade. He was only a sheikh his whole life. When that happened, he didn't know what to do even, you know. But he preserved a sense of, I mean, the durgas were closed. There was no question. All the durgas were closed. Some people met quietly and secretly, but no more than 10, 15, 20 people the most sometimes, you know, outside of Istanbul a little bit, very quietly, you know. And then in the 50s, Sadruddin Hepper went to the municipality of Konya and convinced them to allow the Sema to begin again as a tourist attraction. That's the only way they would hear about it. But he held out until they allowed the permission to recite the Quran also at the Sema. And so slowly in the early 50s, a few people started to turn, and then a few more, and then it went into the sports center, and it became a kind of tourist attraction. You know, it's supposed to be the zikr of the Mevlevi, but it's something else. And there's so many factions now around it that no one can actually define, you know, who's in charge or what's supposed to be done with it. But at the same time, in the early 60s, you know, the Nuruddin Jarahi Tekke was opened. Muzaffar Effendi opened the doors. He said Faridin Effendi was still alive, but he was sick. And Muzaffar Effendi was the sheikh, and he said, I'm opening the doors. And he did, and he created a foundation that was for the study of ancient dervish music, ilahis, you know, that was sung through the whole Ottoman Empire. And so that foundation is what we go to now. And the repetition of those ilahis is a study, you know, of what things were in the past.
I didn't realize it was Muzaffar Effendi himself who did that. Yeah, so you were probably one of the... So was your, like, taking the path with Muzaffar Effendi, was at the same time as you're taking the path of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah and becoming Muslim? Was that concurrent?
I first entered Islam through tasawwuf, through Sufism. And after a while, I then took hand as a Muslim. Right? But I had a big taste of, and after a while, I realized that I love this Sufism, but I'm not going to see this door open any further than it is unless I embrace Islam. When I realized that, I knew I had to embrace Islam. Many people embrace Islam immediately. My way, I'm just saying the way it happened to me. I came through the door of Sufism. And I think a lot of people in the West of my generation came through that door. Later, I think people just embraced Islam and then discovered Sufism afterwards. You know? But when I first did the book on the whirling dervishes, there was on the bookshelves in the New York books, there were only a couple of spiritual bookstores. Samuel Weiser was one, and there was a couple of others. There was only 2-3 books on Mevlana on the shelves. There was Nicholson's translation of the Mathnawi, and then Arbery, who was Nicholson's student, had translated some verses also, and Fihi Mafihi, and And that was really about it, and a couple of little things that people had written that Ashraf in Pakistan had published, and they drifted into the Western bookshelves.
Inayat Khan and Idris Shah, those were probably, those kind of...
But Idris Shah later. Inayat Khan, of course, was earlier. Idris Shah
80s.
sort of got popular with stories on Hoja Nasruddin, on Mullah Nasruddin, and people said, oh, these are great stories. And they were great stories. They still are great stories. But his popularity came through that. But Inayat Khan came in, I think, 1927, something like that, and was teaching in California, but not necessarily teaching Islam with the outward expression of Islam. Right. He explained that, I think, later. And although he prayed 5 times a day himself, and he was a Muslim, and of course he introduced it in a more gentle, let's say, way to a Western audience that had no idea about Islam.
Sure.
So there were some books that Inayat Khan had done that came through the East-West publishing in Europe, and then found their way into the States. And then I did this book on the whirling dervishes. And now, the shelves are flooded with books on Mevlana and books on Sufism and on, the Mevlevi and...
And so... Yeah, so in the 70s, there's very little. And so you basically come and you're, in the company of Muzaffar Effendi, and then eventually, like a few years later, you become Muslim, like officially, right? And then Muzaffar Effendi comes to America in the late 70s, right? He starts coming.
78, I believe.
And he kind of comes like every year through the early 80s until he passed away.
He passed in 85.
And so were you there for those?
All of them.
All of them.
Yeah.
And what was that like when he would come?
Well, for those of us who had taken hand with him, had become part of, that system of belief, and we're Muslims, and we're praying and going to mosque and going to Jummah and, doing Ramadan and of course it was great because it was our teacher was coming to be with us, and he would come, and those days we would just spend day in and day out, all day long. We wouldn't go to work, and we would go and sit with him all day and all night, and several nights we would make zikr and sing and like this, and it was sort of, you can't do it today. For example, the people in charge today of such a thing have 500 people that want to make a zikr every night. Well, you can't take 500 people for coffee and just make sort of sohbet with them. It's not possible. When Muzaffar Effendi was around, there were 12 to 15 people we went for coffee at night. That's possible. 500 is not possible. So things changed, and I think it's harder today to be the leader of a Sufi order or a Sufi, presentation in some way than it was in those earlier days, even though they had to go through certain struggles, to even make it emerge again, in some way. Don't forget, in Turkey, until 1947, from the time it became a republic, nobody could go to Hajj. 1947 they went to Hajj, 48 they closed it again, 49 they opened it, and since 49 people have been able to go to Hajj. So it was a difficult time, for Islam even within Turkey,
And so, but I know that when Muzaffar Effendi would come, there would be large audiences, and they would do zikr in like big churches and things. So how was that reception, and how do you think, like, how did he like America, and how was the reception by it?
He loved America. And he always said, I love America because the people ask questions. They want to know, and they don't let you stop, and he loved that. And he was fed by the fact that we ask questions all the time, and we'd ask deep questions about life. We didn't ask whether we should paint our door red or green, or be partners with somebody in business. We asked real serious questions. We were all in some form or another. We were in some kind of a spiritual path before we touched that. So we had certain experiences, like whether it was meditation or whether it was, prayer, or whether it was whatever form it came in, So he loved that, and he loved American that way, and he loved going to the St. John of the Divine in this huge open space, have 2,000 people there, and at some point in the closed zikr that just the people he brought with him would make it, he would stand up with his arms raised and sort of wave people, just come in and join us, right? And you'd have like 2,000 people in these circles, a few of them, it stuck, it's like anything else, And some of them, like in New Yorkers, are very cool, Hey, I went to a zikr last night and it was really cool. And tonight I'm going to the Tibetan thing. And Friday night I'm going to the Buddhist, So it was like that energy was always there. So they participated in that. And I would say almost a small percentage of those people that would come and experience that actually became Muslims and Sufis like that.
Right. Yeah, that is a curious thing, and it's almost like, you think of so many people, in those days from your generation, really spiritually seeking, and like a buffet, kind of taking a little from here, a little from there, and sampling all these different traditions. But when it really comes to committing to a specific path, not just Islam, but there's, it's a small minority that can, committed to any path. It seemed, it was kind of like a spiritual tourism, but at the same time, a lot of, mindfulness and meditation is now in the boardrooms and in the juvenile hall. They teach meditation to the, to young, men and women, and yoga is on every corner, and Rumi is top-selling poet. So there is a permeation of the culture, even if it's on a more superficial level than what some of us, are seeing, are feeling like these great masters are actually calling to. But yeah, I'm curious what you think about that as well.
Well, I think that this is true. This exists, but I think it's good for all those people. And I think the people that just think Mevlana is the poet of love, and are enamored by that, that's fine for them, But Mevlana is the poet of love, But he's the poet of metaphysical love, and nothing Mevlana ever said or did was not based on the Quran or the Hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the people that don't see that see another part of it. They see a surface part of it. They love the poetry, and they like, they think, oh, the poet of love, how wonderful, we should all love each other, but it's a much deeper thing than that, you love each other because we're the creation of the one we love, the creation of Allah. That's why we love other people and plants and flowers and things, because they're the creation of Allah. And it's the love of Allah that introduces us how to love humankind. Or maybe we learn to love humankind and then we can somehow connect that to Allah. But Rumi was involved with the love of Allah. Through the love of Allah, he loved mankind.
Yeah, mashallah. Yeah, and so, it's really nice to go to the Drahi Tekke, the Drahi Lodge here in Istanbul when I'm here, and it's one of my favorite kind of zikrs. The zikr is so many parts, and it's like development, movement and chanting and reciting Quran, but it's also nice to see you there because you're one of the elders. You're one of the more senior members of the order, and you've been part of it for 40 years or something like that. And you're, in the minority of those who maybe even met Muzaffar Effendi now or knew him closely. And so it's really interesting to just see, and to see like the respect and the reverence that people have for you. So yeah, maybe you could just speak about the fact that like Yeah, and you mentioned to me once too, like when we were talking about Muzaffar Effendi coming to America and the effect he had, and you're saying like, well, there's not a lot of Americans that are here right now. It's one, and you're here too. You're the second right now. You know, so yeah, just being part of this order in Turkey, you know, in this way and living here, you know, maybe you could share a little bit about that experience.
Well, when I retired from teaching at the American University in Cairo after being there for 20 years, we could have gone anywhere. I mean, our children were all grown and married, and those responsibilities had, if not eliminated, diminished. But I sort of chose, I wanted to live in Istanbul because I wanted to be close to Mevlana. I wanted to be close to zikr and remembrance of Allah. Not to say that you can't be close to remembrance of Allah anywhere in the world that you are. Of course you can, you know. But there are great reminders here. It's one of the most beautiful cities in the world. You can walk down the street. There are beautiful mosques. There's great calligraphy on buildings. There's just reminders. There was a time when the Muslim would walk down the street and everything he saw or touched or smelled or ate had to do with Islam. You know, he'd hear the call to prayer through his hearing. He would be able to say the prayers. He would, all the five senses were enjoined in the experience of living in that city and hearing and seeing and feeling and touching and being in that environment. And I think it still exists to the degree that you can bring something to it. You know, otherwise it's like sometimes in Cairo, I would hear people complain that were not really active Muslims just complaining that, I wish the muezzin wouldn't be so loud with a megaphone. It wakes us up in the morning, you know. So you have that balance everywhere, you know. For me, I felt I wanted to spend my last years here and be with people who are of like mind.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you've been very generous with your time, and we'll, you know, if we can link to some of your work. But you know, you're prolific in a multitude of mediums, right? You're an author, painter, photographer, filmmaker, and you know, I think I've read not only this Winter's Harvest, which is your memoirs, but when you hear hoofbeats, think of a zebra, right? That was your first or one of your earlier ones. And then also a book about the whirling dervishes.
The Forgotten Message.
Yeah, that's a more recent one, Forgotten Message about Rumi. So you've written a couple books about Rumi. One about the whirling dervishes, and you made a film about Rumi. What am I forgetting? There's others, right?
A few things, but it doesn't. I don't like to think of myself as a writer or a painter, a designer, educator, you know, photographer. I don't like to think of myself as that. What I like to think of myself as a person who writes and photographs and paints and like that. You know, I think it's important that we make that separation. You know, that you're a person first, and that these are some of the things that you do, and whatever art I do as a painter or a photographer, I'm really doing in a sense to understand myself. And I'm not that interested. I've had some shows, but I'm not that interested in having shows. I'm not that interested in selling work. I've had other ways of making a living. I've been a professor and educator and a graphic designer, you know. But what I feel strongly is that one can understand oneself through art. And that it's a medium that speaks not only to others but to yourself. So I use the art that comes out of me to also understand certain things of my own inner nature and my own being. So
beautiful. That's a beautiful note to end on. Jazakallah khair for your time, and We look forward to you sharing more of what comes out of your being, inshallah.
Inshallah.